PowerPoint that I have. So it's currently disabled. So I don't know if you can enable me, or if not, you can simply put the PowerPoint on from your end, Nira, and I can just tell you when to advance.
I'll try to enable you. 1 second. And then if that doesn't work on your end, I can try to allow for...
Here we go. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Sorry,
No problem. Take your time. It's a learning curve for all of us.
yeah. All right. Well, let's see if that works. There we go. Okay.
There we go.
All right. I will. Okay. Except I'm in the wrong spot here. Let me start from the beginning. Okay, so I was asked by the Art Commission of the City of Pittsburgh just last week to speak for 15 minutes about the history and context of this monument, the Columbus Monument in a park in Pittsburgh. The city and the Art Commission are currently trying to figure out whether to remove it or alter it in some way in response to sort of the worldwide protests that have been going on over the past several months. And so I was put in the unusual position for me of trying to present a so-called neutral talk about this monument, which I don't feel neutral about at all. And I have never actually published anything on Columbus monuments, so it's an interesting thing for me to go and really, I've been thinking about this monument for about 30 years because it's right across a bridge from the building that I worked in before the pandemic. So it's been on my mind for a long time. I've taken classes there. I've done a lot of thinking about it. This is the first time to really sort of gather my thoughts. And I think it was a very interesting exercise because it is really almost the example par excellence of the hero monument. Okay, and there are over 200 monuments to Columbus in the United States. We don't know the exact figure yet because we don't have really complete inventories. There are several hundred more around the world, so this is a global phenomenon. They are even in Africa and Asia, if you can believe that. But it's particularly striking how many there are in the United States. Columbus is the single heroic figure with the largest number of public statues in the country. So George Washington is a distant second, probably with less than half the number of public statues that Columbus has. This is seemingly pretty odd for a man who sailed under the flag of Spain and never stepped foot in the continental United States. And of course, there have been, especially in the last several months, but really over about the past 2 years, there have been a number of these statues that have come down in the United States. In Buffalo, Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, Los Angeles, at least a dozen other cities, including, of course, Boston, where, as you probably know, on the North End, the statue there was beheaded at night and then removed to storage, and it's under my understanding is it's under consideration right now what to do with it in the future. So unlike this particular statue that was moved because of vandalism. Most of the removals have actually been made by city governments, not by protesters. And even some places like British Columbia and Columbus, Ohio, are actually having serious conversations about changing their names. So why is it then that Columbus became such a ubiquitous figure in the commemorative landscape in the first place? And of course, that's because of his adoption by Italian American organizations starting in the late 19th century and continuing well into the 20th, all the way up to 1992, the 500th anniversary of his landing. These were immigrant organizations that had faced, representing Italians who had faced discrimination themselves in the United States, much like Mexicans and Central Americans today. Columbus became a legitimating figure for them and became really integral to Italian American culture. So in Pittsburgh, for example, the largest ethnic group to immigrate to Pittsburgh by 1930 were Italians. And so it became a really large political force in the city, as they were in many other cities like Boston as well. And in some ways, what they were doing was, in a way, an interesting response to some of the commemoration that had been done of more traditional American figures like George Washington. There is one Washington statue in Pittsburgh, my hometown now, erected in 1891. It was actually erected by this organization called the Junior Order of United Mechanics of America, which was a nativist organization. It was an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic organization that used Washington as a native symbol, as other groups did in the 19th century. And so this was an organization, for example, that didn't actually refused to accept Blacks into their organization and voted repeatedly not to in the 19th and even into the early 20th century. So it was in that kind of climate that Italian American ethnic groups sort of countered in a certain way with their own legitimating figure of Columbus, who as a Genovese was someone that they could use as a symbol of their own ethnic pride, but their attachment to the United States as well, which I'll get to in just a moment. So what is the ground of Columbus's heroism? It's really found in those three words that you see on the pedestal below his name, the discoverer of America. His entire connection to the story of the United States and the history of this country has been through that notion of him as the original discoverer of the New World. And that term, of course, is highly loaded and has become even more so in recent years. But still, in 1992, when the statue was restored, and I was already in Pittsburgh by that time, when the statue was restored by the city and rededicated, it was in a resolution called, as you can see on the slide here, the magnificent Columbus Monument, symbol of Pittsburgh's colorful spectrum of cultures and heritage. So it turned into a kind of multicultural monument in 1992, despite what were the burgeoning worldwide protests that were happening at that same time, driven by indigenous peoples around the globe in response to the 500th anniversary of his landing. So Columbus belongs very much to the great man theory of history. This idea that history is made by great men who kind of rise up out of their time, out of ordinary time, and make a unique mark on the world. Nietzsche called it monumental history for a reason. And as a philosophy of history, it's really absurdly out of date, but it's alive and well in public space, in monuments to this day. Public monuments are inherently a very conservative form because of the idea that they are timeless, which is a fiction, and we can get to that later, maybe in the Q&A portion of our evening tonight. But it's a fiction in many different ways, this idea of timelessness. So I was asked by the Art Commission to partly to review Columbus the Man, and to talk about him, because the response to the Hero Monument is when the Hero Monument is challenged, the response is to challenge the biography, is almost the starting point is the response is to challenge the biography of the hero himself. So I had to do a bit of a crash course in the history of Columbus and Hispaniola in particular. It's a very horrific history, a very horrific story, and it was very depressing to actually do that, and to have to be able to show in very stark terms that he was not only a colonizer, a brutal colonizer, but an enslaver as well. And much of this comes from his second voyage, not the first voyage, in which he landed on this island, San Salvador, that he named San Salvador in the Bahamas. But from his second voyage in which he actually created or planted a colony, attempted to plant a colony in Hispaniola, which is the island that is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But everywhere he went, essentially, he took captives and enslaved them. And he also planted the standard, the flag of Spain, and he would read out a proclamation in Spanish to the indigenous peoples that he could gather around him there, telling them that he was taking their land on behalf of Spain. And he proudly wrote back to his monarchs, his patrons back in Spain, and said no one objected. They couldn't understand, of course, a word he said because it was in Spanish. But he said no one objected on his first voyage. When he came back on his second voyage, a lot of them did in fact object and began to resist their occupation and conquest by this foreign people. And Columbus himself responded very strenuously and very brutally to that resistance, and put it down in really horrific ways, killing and raping and looting along the way. His men mostly did that. And then once he had pacified the population, he forced them into, he forced labor to mine gold. Each one of them had to mine a certain quota of gold. And he also took 550 slaves back with him to Spain to sell. Most of them died, almost all of them died along the way or shortly thereafter. So the story is a horrific, it's a horrific story of both of colonization, conquest, enslavement, and eventually decimation of the native population. And there's really very little debate about it anymore in the scholarly literature. There's still some people who blame most of it on Columbus's men, but instead of himself. But there's no question that he was the leader of the enterprise and that he was responsible for the forced labor and enslavement of the population there. Okay, so that was Columbus the Man, who looks, by contrast in this print, looks like a kind of Renaissance humanist. But that's what he did, and that's one of the grounds for the worldwide reaction against his commemoration. But I also wanted to point out in my talk to them, I wanted to point out that it's not just about him as a man, what he did as an individual, but it's equally, and even more importantly, in a certain sense, and more importantly in understanding why he became a commemorative figure in the United States, understand him as a symbol and why he was used as a symbol. And you can see that in place names. You can see the way in which long before Italian Americans adopted him as sort of their hero, he had been adopted by the United States, by the Anglo-American population of the United States as a kind of ancestor of their conquest of the continent. And you can see that in place names. And it's very interesting to chart the dates of these names because they tend to follow close after the final expulsion of the Indians in those territories where the place names appear. So, for example, in District of Columbia was one of the most important place names, named after Columbus in 1791. That's the very beginning of our of the nation. But in places like Pennsylvania, the first town of Columbus was named in 1800, really just a couple of years after, on the northwest frontier of the state, a couple of years after the final conclusion of the Indian Wars there. And it goes on by this list of names. You can see that happening, and we get to Columbus, Georgia, where that town was named on land that had belonged to the Muskogee people, the Creeks. They were called then Muskogee, is their own term. And that town was actually put on their land that they were forced, the last remaining land that they had in Georgia, that they were forced to give up in 1827. So just 1 year later appears the town of Columbus, Georgia. And we see this over and over and over and over again. So there's this very strong association between Columbus as the discoverer and the United States as the conqueror of Indian lands. And the very first statue of Columbus erected in the United States was not erected by Italian American organizations, but was actually sponsored and financed by the US Congress. And that's this statue here, fittingly entitled The Discovery of America, from the east front of the Capitol. And excuse me. It was erected, it was initiated in 1836, and it was designed and erected over the period of time in which the final removal of tens of thousands of Native peoples in the Southeast was happening, when Trail of Tears was happening, when the Cherokees were forced to Oklahoma, and along with the Choctaws and the Chickasaw and others. All at the very same time that was happening, this statue was being commissioned, sculpted, and erected in Washington, D.C. And you can see that it follows one of the traditional formulas for a hero statue, which is to put in a foil. So the hero is made more heroic by his pairing with a foil figure, a subordinate inferior person, who magnifies his heroism and majesty. In this case, it's this cowering female figure who represented the native peoples of America. Right? This was also the very first Columbus statue to be removed in the United States in 1958, which is very interesting because that was the year that the Columbus Monument in Pittsburgh was actually erected. So in the very same year that that monument was erected, this monument is going down. And one of the main reasons that it went down was because of this racist representation of Native peoples, and tribal governments had begun to have more of a voice in federal politics at this point in time. And so that was one of the reasons that led to its removal. And we can see that perhaps most famously, that formula of the hero with the foil figure, the subordinate figure below him, in the Freedmen's Memorial to Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. And also, I put this up because you know it, because there's a replica in Boston that, and I don't know, you can tell me whether it's actually come down or not. I know the decision to remove it has been made. The one in Washington is still under investigation. We don't know what's going to happen to it, and probably won't know until after the election. So in Pittsburgh, the hero has no foil, right? The hero is a single figure on a pedestal, and this is another very common representation of a hero, single figure without any subordinate figure. But what's interesting here is even though he stands alone on the pedestal, as if he's up on top of the ship with the wind kind of billowing his cloak behind him as he looks out at the lands that he's about to discover, right? That even though there is no overt foil to him, there's a kind of a hidden foil here, or implied foil, which is the great untamed wilderness that he is about to discover and subjugate, which of course includes those native peoples also in it. So they're a kind of absent presence. So they're not represented anymore explicitly as they were in Washington, the statue in Washington, but they are implied. They are implied presence by the figure and the notion of discovery of him as a discoverer, which is explicit on the pedestal. So the monument, in a sense, asks us to participate in a kind of sleight of hand, a cognitive sleight of hand. It asks us to identify with this man who anticipates proudly the conquest and destruction of native land and native peoples that lies ahead of him. And what I want to point out here is that the heroic monument is not simply a kind of sign or a billboard. It's not just competing for attention. It's actually an exalted object that is imposing itself on us and demanding our assent. So each time we pass by an image like this in public space, it tacitly demands a choice. Do we assent or do we dissent to it? Do we resist its question that it's asking us? In this kind of commemorative space, the people who have resisted or struggled against the would-be heroes have had little, if any, space to maneuver in this landscape and to make their claims to historical presence. Our commemorative landscape is really a landscape full of enslavers and conquerors and white supremacists. So those who have struggled and fought against them have very little recognition, even less of a place to assert their own existence in this landscape, much less their own aspirations. So what is done instead, things like acts of vandalism. I know one of our speakers is going to be talking about vandalism this evening, but that's one way to make the history and pain of colonization visible on the statue itself. And paint the hands red and splash the different words on the pedestal to counter the words that are already there, to counter that myth of discovery. That's one kind of way of responding that dissents to the statue. Another is ritual like this, which happened on Indigenous Peoples Day in 2015, where I was present, where we were all asked to ritualistically turn our backs to the monument and to listen to speakers in front of us. So we ritualistically denied the heroic effect of the monument by turning our backs to it. And most recently, we have, since the murder of George Floyd and the worldwide kind of protests that have happened there, we have seen even increased vandalism now of the monument with words like genocide, colonizer, murder. So the monument being revised in front of our very eyes. So what I want to leave you with is the idea that is the question about whether we should continue this kind of heroic commemorative space. You know, what is our response to this legacy? Is it to build new heroic monuments, or is it to reject the premises of the heroic landscape altogether and build a new kind of commemorative sphere? In general, we're what we have been doing so far in the United States is to build new heroic monuments. So we have monuments like to Martin Luther King, gigantic statue. That example is an interesting one because in the original design discussions and even plans for that monument, there were ideas of putting in other figures from the civil rights movement around him, surrounding him, and those were eventually taken away so that he would stand alone without anyone around him. So he becomes that lone, that great man who signifies the movement without showing a collective around him. So, but there are, I think, other ways of maybe approaching the commemorative sphere which would more radically transform it and maybe provide more of a space for the representation of collective struggles in history. And that's something I'm happy to talk about in our question and answer period, but I'm going to stop there and let our other speakers take over.
Thank you so much, Kirk. That was really fascinating. Chong-Ming, please go ahead.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So I don't have slides, so I'm just going to talk, and since you have to be looking at my face for the next 20 minutes or so. So many thanks to Dana and Nia for organizing this wonderful workshop. I'm going to be speaking a little about one way that we can treat controversial monuments, but which has received, I think, relatively little attention in academic circles. And that is the vandalism of these monuments. So we've seen from Kirk's talk that activists have been doing this for a long time, but academics haven't really been talking about it. So given time and space constraints, I won't be giving a full-fledged defense of vandalizing monuments. So instead, I'll provide a qualified or constrained argument for it, conditional on the lack of failure of better ways of dealing with them. Of course, there are many potential ways in which we can deal with controversial monuments, and I don't argue that my qualified defense of vandalism is better than any or all such responses. Instead, I'll focus on just two opposing responses that currently dominate public discussions, which are to remove the monuments entirely or to preserve them as they are. Now, these two positions are often treated as extreme, especially by people who oppose them. And we also often hear people on both sides calling each other unreasonable, naive, radical, terrorists, among other things. Now, but actually, neither of these positions are on their own unreasonable or naive. Now, first of all, when we commemorate through the building of monuments, historical persons or events associated with racist or unjust actions or views, it does appear that we are at the same time honoring those actions or views and the values underlying them. Now, this introduces serious uncertainties about whether we genuinely and fully respect and regard members of minority groups as equals within our communities. Now, we may describe monuments that do this as being in some sense tainted. At their worst, tainted monuments may also be part of a systematic effort to intimidate minority members of our communities, as has often been the case. Now, these uncertainties are serious, especially when we see that they are often set in contexts where there are significant inequalities between citizens along many different dimensions. Now, in these contexts, the commemoration of these people or events cannot be easily waved away or dismissed as innocent or neutral attempts to remember history. And this we've seen again from Kirk's talk. Now, insofar as all of us wish to live in communities where our status as equals is stable and secure along different dimensions, we have good reason, I take it, to remove these sources of uncertainties. Now, I take that what I've just said is a reasonable gloss of what may be called the activist position for removing controversial or more specifically tainted monuments. Now, these considerations I think are fairly obvious. In fact, when they're put this way, they appear to naturally point us to the conclusion that tainted monuments should be removed. I think a case could certainly be made on their basis that removing many tainted monuments is the way to go. However, the conclusion that we should remove these monuments is often resisted by those who seek to preserve these monuments. Let's call proponents of this camp preservationists. And one quick note about my use of labels. When I refer to positions as activists or preservationists, this is not intended to imply that activists or preservationists are homogenous. I think there's always dissent amongst groups, within groups, no matter how much their members may generally agree on. So my references to the activist or preservationist positions should be taken as a shorthand for the claims that are very often made by members of these groups. Now, in arguing that case, preservationists often appeal to the importance of history or of remembering our past. Of course, we know that preservationists are often accused of arguing in bad faith. Now, according to those who seek to remove tainted monuments, the real motivations of preservationists actually lie elsewhere, in their endorsement of or their wish to defend the racist or unjust actions or views of the people being honored. Now, that is, preservationists are often, regarded as racist, so sometimes the terms are just taken as synonymous. Well, this may well be the case, and here I take no stand on the sociological issue, whether it is indeed so. It remains that we still need to think seriously about the importance of history, of remembering our past, and in this case, via monuments. We shouldn't throw the baby away with the dirty bathwater, so to speak. And in any case, a number of academic historians have also weighed in to stress the importance of preserving these tainted monuments so that they may serve as public and constant reminders of our past mistakes in order that we don't repeat them. Now and again, I take it that this is a reasonable gloss of the preservationist position for keeping tainted monuments where they are. I'll be very happy to talk about this during the Q&A. So now we have two competing positions and two requirements underlying them. So the position to remove tainted monuments is undergirded by the requirement to remove uncertainties in the status of minority members as equals within our communities. The position to preserve tainted monuments is undergirded by the requirement to publicly and constantly remember our past mistakes so that we learn from them and so that we won't repeat them. With these positions and requirements in view, we can then take a quick look at how some mainstream suggestions for how we should deal with monuments fare at satisfying these requirements. Now, one suggestion that's often mentioned and sometimes enacted is to establish monuments of minority members of the community near the tainted monument itself. So I think one notable example, and which I looked at a little bit during my research, is the Silent Sand Confederate statue at the UNC Chapel Hills campus. This statue commemorates the students of the university who fought for the Confederacy as soldiers during the Civil War. The monument was subject, I think, right from the get-go to sustained protests by those who rejected the view expressed, so there's some dissent, and it was also subject to many calls for removal. The preservation of the statue was also vigorously defended by those concerned with the accuracy of historical representation or with historical memory in general. Amidst all these disagreements, the Unsung Founders Memorial was established in 2005 at some distance from the Silent Sand statue in the same park. And this Unsung Founders Memorial was dedicated to the contributions of people of color, many of whom were slaves, to the community. Now we can very quickly take stock of what establishing new monuments in this way does. First, insofar as it leaves the tainted monument untouched, it clearly satisfied the preservationist requirement to leave the statues or monuments in place. Second, it seems to address the community's neglect to honor or commemorate minority members of the community. And third, perhaps most importantly, the new monument expresses the view that the people who are now being honored are also equal, if not esteemed, members of the community. This appears, I think, to address the uncertainties and insecurities about whether the community genuinely regards them as equals, and often is intended to address these uncertainties and insecurities. However, and despite appearances, establishing new monuments may not actually satisfy the activist requirement. Now, on this front, I think two sociological observations are salient. First, the establishment of the new monument, the new memorial in 2005, did very little to stem the protests against the tainted monument, the Silent Sand monument. Indeed, the protests continued and culminated in the purportedly illegal toppling and removal of the statue in 2018. So for the protesters and activists who toppled the statue, establishing the new monument didn't seem to address their complaints about the tainted monument in the first place. And second, this situation doesn't seem to be peculiar to the dispute about the Silent Sand statue, but seems to be generalized to other tainted monuments. So historians, I think, have suggested that the establishment of new monuments doesn't typically cancel out or repudiate the messages of tainted and especially white supremacist monuments. Instead, their existence merely facilitates the development of some convoluted ideology of dual heritage, according to which white and non-white, especially Black Americans, simply took different but equally honorable paths to their status as equal members of the community. Now, obviously, this is a false picture. The main point here is that insofar as establishing new monuments doesn't address the problem of honoring racist or unjust persons' actions or views, it doesn't actually satisfy the activist requirement. One quick way of seeing this is to notice how the new monument doesn't actually repudiate the messages conveyed by the tainted monument. That is, it doesn't say, no, these people or actions are not worthy of honor. It says instead, hey, these other members of our community are also worthy of honor. And it should be clear why this doesn't really satisfy the activist requirement. Another common suggestion on how we should treat tainted monuments is to add contextualizing information, so contextualizing plaques to tainted monuments. So in light of what has been said so far, this appears to be a much more promising, I think, in virtue of its potential to directly address and repudiate the views expressed by a tainted monument. Much more promising response. That is, contextualizing plaques can say, hey, this guy here, you see here before you, is not worthy of honor. In fact, he's responsible for all these terrible things that we now reject and condemn. And insofar as the addition of these contextualizing information preserves the tainted monument, it seems again to satisfy the preservationist requirement. There are, however, two problems with simply adding contextualizing information to tainted monuments. The first concerns the accessibility of contextualizing plaques relative to tainted monuments. So the more fully contextualizing the plaques are, the lengthier and more inaccessible they will be. As it is often recognized, it takes much more work to repudiate hateful, disrespectful speech and messages than to make it. So, someone makes a false claim about history, you need to say a lot more about how and why it distorts history. So you need to do a lot more work to undo some of the bad things that have been said. This worry is very pronounced when it comes to monuments, which present the information in a primarily visual format. So you see the monument of a great man, we've seen some pictures before, it conveys, very quickly and very simply a message about the person being honored. Whereas contextualizing plaques do so in a primarily textual format. These differences in accessibility will affect, I think, the effectiveness of the contextualization in addressing, the problems that arise from tainted monuments. The second problem is that contextualizing plaques are comparatively much smaller than the tainted monuments whose views they seek to repudiate. So, and then again, so this should be fairly obvious. The smaller these plaques are, the more easily they will be missed by the people who interact with or merely pass by the tainted monuments. They will also not be seen when the tainted monuments are viewed from a distance. I imagine a grandiose and larger-than-life statue of a historical oppressor, accompanied by a long wall of text on a small plaque. Suddenly, the plaque doesn't seem to do that much work, in addressing in satisfying the activist requirement and in addressing problems that arise from the tainted monuments. So while the addition of contextualizing information fares better than establishing new monuments and repudiating tainted monuments, it still falls short. Now, by the way, a form of this problem also seems to apply to establishing new monuments, which is that the tainted monuments may still be seen or appreciated in isolation from the new monuments that have been erected. Now, finally, we move on to vandalism. Now, I think it's especially noteworthy that a very common response by activists to what they regard as tainted monuments is to engage in vandalism. So the range of kinds of vandalism is also quite broad. So we've seen some pictures from Kirk. But people, in addition to throwing paint, people have also thrown shit. Some people have just taken hammers and smashed the statues' faces in. We've seen instances of beheading and so on. Now, vandalism, I think, has some things going for it in terms of narrowly, in terms of its ability to satisfy the two opposing requirements, the activist and the preservationist requirements. So it indicates clearly and prominently that some people within the community think that the person or event being represented by the monument is an inappropriate recipient of honor, so it makes the dissent obvious. So, for instance, activists often splash red paint signifying blood on tainted monuments to convey, and often quite effectively, that the person being honored was responsible for or involved in injustice. Now, the possibility of viewing the monument in isolation from the vandalism is ruled out in virtue of the fact that the thing is on the monument itself. Most importantly, and in many cases, vandalism can transform a tainted monument from a public honoring of an inappropriate recipient or inappropriate target into a public repudiation of its being such an appropriate recipient of honor. In some cases, it may even turn the tainted monument into a public humiliation of the target. Now, if vandalism successfully does these things, it could be an appropriate response, I think, to tainted monuments, which satisfies the two opposing requirements. So first, here we appear to have a response which may very well mitigate or eliminate uncertainties about whether a community genuinely and fully respects minority members as equals within their community. Second, a prominently vandalized monument may even better stress the importance of remembering our past in order that we don't repeat our mistakes from the past. Of course, this doesn't actually mean, and I don't mean to say, that everyone should just start vandalizing every statue or monument they see and which they don't like. Vandalism is, I think, generally regarded quite poorly, and some care should be made to distinguish principled vandalism from its unprincipled variant. Critics of vandalism often claim that vandals and their views are not representative of the community. Now, while this claim is overused, you see it all the time, politicians, representative persons from preservationist groups. While this claim is overused, there is a genuine worry, I take it, underlying it. That is, a singular act by a non-representative individual may not actually mitigate or eliminate the uncertainties faced by members of minority groups about whether the community as a whole genuinely respects them as equals. One way this worry may be addressed, I think, is if the vandals receive support from or are part of other activists, groups or organizations which are then representative of those members of minority groups or whose statuses are at stake, and ideally also of other members within the community. This may be in the form of public statements released before or after the fact of vandalism in support of the message that the act of vandalism conveys. The more affirmation the vandals receive and the greater the variety of groups from which they receive such affirmation, that is, the more representative the actions are of the views of the community as a whole, the more securely will the uncertainties caused by tainted monuments be mitigated or eliminated. Many people, especially state officials, often highlight and criticize the illegality of vandalism. On this issue, my take is that the vandalism of tainted monuments doesn't need to be illegal. In fact, if the state and its agencies are serious about mitigating or eliminating the uncertainties faced by minority members of our community, as well as to ensure that members of the community can nonetheless remember their past, so these are the two requirements, they can invite representative minority members or members of formerly oppressed groups to vandalize or to modify the tainted monuments, and then to take steps in ensuring that the tainted monuments remain defaced or modified. I think permitting vandalized monuments to stay vandalized also addresses the following worry. Now, if the vandalized monument is restored to its original state and sort of cleaned up, as it were, the accompanying public statements that are released around the time of vandalism are likely to be forgotten over time. Moreover, public statements are on their own susceptible to the difficulties besetting the earlier responses. So once the vandalized monument is restored, people can again interact with it in isolation from the statements that have been released. The tainted monument is also more prominent and accessible than the statements that have been released, in the sense that you have to dig through archives to find what people have said. And it's also, more prominent and accessible than the memory of its being vandalized at an earlier point in time. Now, since we have reason to think that these worries render the earlier responses unable to securely satisfy the activist requirement, we now here have reason to think that restoring vandalized monuments would have the same effect. Allowing painted monuments to stay vandalized would mitigate these worries. It would allow the statements to be continually sent and in an accessible manner to anyone who interacts with the monument. I think it would be even better if the relevant authorities protect the vandalized monuments from private efforts to restore its appearances. Now, indeed, allowing tainted monuments to remain vandalized or modified could even be a part of a broader project of rectifying the mistakes of the past and undoing their lingering effects, and even as a way for the state to own up to its complicity in many of these mistakes. So all that I've said, I take it, is partially vindicative of what activists have been doing for a long, long time. Now, so I'm just going to very quickly sum up. By way of concluding, I want to stress that my discussion of vandalism is constrained and quite narrow. I considered two opposing requirements undergirding the activist and preservationist positions. I've also considered only two mainstream responses to tainted monuments, which are to establish new monuments and to add contextualizing information. To recap, my claim is that vandalism, when taken as a response, fares better than these two mainstream responses at securing both the activist and preservationist requirements. Now, there may very well be more requirements than the two I've discussed, and there certainly are more ways that we can deal with tainted monuments besides the two mainstream ones of removing or preserve them. Whether we have, eventually, an all things considered argument for vandalizing tainted monuments will depend on how we deal with these additional requirements and responses. To give an example quite quickly, aesthetic considerations may feature strongly in the case of some tainted monuments or tainted objects in general. In these cases, the preservationist position may be supported by an additional requirement to leave the tainted monument or tainted object as it is without modification. This becomes especially pertinent when we think about historical works of art or monuments with great or unique aesthetic merits, but which are tainted in the ways already discussed. There's been some, for a long time, talk of how many, artistic masterpieces actually present women in not too great a light. There's a question of what we ought to do about these works of art. My discussions of vandalism don't apply immediately or easily to these cases at all. And my hope is to slowly work through these complications in subsequent work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chong-Ming. That was great. Dana, the floor is yours.
So thank you, everyone. So please forgive me. Before I had to talk, I had to teach two classes back to back. So my voice is a little bit raw. But I do want to thank both Kirk and Chong-Ming for presenting first. That just happened to be a trick of the schedule. But Kirk, I really do love the discussion of how we assent or dissent to a monument. And with Chong-Ming, how we can either have an activist or preservationist leaning when it comes to monument. Because I think both your presentation and my presentation as well as a follow-up will be dealing with how monuments call on us to engage with history, with politics, with our political communities. And it's this engagement that is usually missing from conversations about monuments at an everyday level. So without controversy, without conflict, a monument is just part of our public. It's just a background material that calls on us maybe to view it, maybe to witness it, maybe to walk by it, but doesn't offer direct engagement except in the cases of controversy. So whether we're dealing with racial monuments or racist monuments, Confederate monuments, colonial monuments, monuments that provoke political disagreement, this is really where I see engagement happening. And so with my brief presentation, what I seek to do is to talk about the ways in which we fail to actually engage with monuments. And some of this failure is a failure of conception, a failure to see the multiplicity, the diversity, or the different positions that monuments actually entail. So to keep it in the theme of controversy, again, if we look at a monument, we know that there are protests happening currently, particularly Black Lives Matter protests that were first provoked with Trayvon Martin's death in 2012, or you can point in 2020 to George Floyd. And of course, there are other figures, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Maury, that are again present within these disagreements, within these controversy. One does not just look at a monument and decide to vandalize it and tear it down. There are always background assumptions that we should also consider. And so with that being said, I think part of the difficulty in dealing with monuments is that if we see a controversy happening, we can easily point out and say, well, that has to be a controversial monument. Because people are either protesting it, people are vandalizing, something's going on with the monument. But we can also go and look beforehand and say, well, what monuments are non-controversial? And then we have to ask, well, to who? To what groupings of people? Is it now popularly controversial? Is that what's going on? So even if you look at certain figures that are entering into the equation, so I'm going to step aside from Confederate monuments because I think they present an easier target. And so if we were just to ask, or if I were to ask to everyone that is here, well, what are the crimes of George Washington? What are the crimes of Thomas Jefferson? Again, putting it in that scenario, because similar to how, well, again, due to Kirk's presentation, we know there are less statues to George Washington than Christopher Columbus, but still there are many statues. He's still an iconic American hero, American figure within the United States. Even if we point to Mount Rushmore, or for the Sioux Nation, the Six Grandfathers. If we point to that monument or sacred ground, we can again ask, well, for the Sioux Nation and indigenous people, those figures are always problematic representations of settler colonialism. So when we are now saying they're controversial, we're really meaning to a public that hasn't always considered indigenous perspectives. But for me, what is interesting is that move from non-controversial to controversial, or Federico Palantini and Mario Bersini, in their work, they say it's a move from a cold monument to a hot monument that is now politically controversial. What we actually see in that transformation is a common response. For many people, we can talk about the activist position that George Washington, yes, he did help defeat the British. He was our first American president. These are monumental acts. They help define the history of the United States. But for many figures, indigenous people, this is also a figure of controversy. This is a figure, particularly if you're talking about upstate New York, Washington was a fair name because, again, he not only committed what many would say murder or genocide of indigenous people, he also sowed salt into the ground so they couldn't grow crops. So for many of the historical figures we see as being even non-controversial at certain points in history, it's not a hegemonic case. It's not a case for all people at all times or all people in this community. But because I think a lot of people are in a moderate position, they're not activists, they're not actively preservationists. Again, they're just daily people going about their life and asking themselves, well, I've heard stories since I was in before first grade that Washington was a revered figure. We didn't really talk about any possible crimes. We didn't talk about any possible controversy. And so when they're now talking about this moderate position, well, do I agree that George Washington or Columbus, et cetera, do they deserve to be vandalized? For many people, because they don't actually have a position, they're trying to understand, well, where are these news stories coming from? Because I never heard that. I never heard that there's disagreement with Jefferson or Roosevelt. Even controversy with Abraham Lincoln, if we're sticking with Mount Rushmore. Because a lot of those histories aren't spoken about or taught actively in schools, they're new. And so what people usually try to do is I call a moderate position, a position of historical neutrality. So if we're taking the figure of George Washington, if we're sticking at least with the United States, well, okay, it's true that he fought the British, he was the first president, and he also did this to indigenous people in upstate New York. That this is true or encapsulates his total history. So the moderate position, or the position of historical neutrality asks, can we still have a monument? Can we still have statues that can capture all of these stories, all of these histories? Kirk also mentioned and showed the figure of Christopher Columbus being decapitated in the North End of Boston. Can we have a statue that says, for Italian Americans, he's a revered figure, But for indigenous people, he represents the doctrine of discovery, settler colonialism. Can we actually have a statue that gives reverence to both positions, that honors both positions, that is in a sense impartial? This position, I think, is not only common to moderates, to some historians, to some political theorists such as Hannah Arendt, who argue that Herodotus, the pater historiae, the father of history, according to the Greeks, also tried to capture this position when he wrote about the Persian Wars. He tried to equally honor both the Persians and Greeks. Again, that impartiality, I think, is a common response people have to figures that are prominent in their national histories, in their national story. And so for me, because I see this happening also with the Christopher Columbus statue, because again, Marty Walsh, the Boston mayor, politicians, representatives are also trying to do that same thing. They're seeing controversy. They're seeing disagreement within their constituency and asking, well, how do we satisfy both sides? Is it possible? Can we get Italians and indigenous people together to sort this issue out? And we also know, or at least people from Boston also know, this is why the Columbus statue is still boxed up. Because although this might be a desire to get to a point of historical neutrality, to have statues and monuments represent history impartially, to represent without having a position, without showing any credence, or without saying, I endorse that view. I think this is a position people might lean towards, because if you can represent history without endorsing history, then you, in a sense, cut down controversy. So instead of saying, oh, one group, this is a figure of settler colonialism, well, this impartial statue, this impartial monument actually represents you both. And as a multicultural, diverse society, society of plurality, don't you want that equal representation for all people? Now, the trouble becomes with this position is that, and I think Chong-Ming highlighted this with the activist position, is that for some histories, they do deserve condemnation. And I think one of the best representations, at least philosophically, about this position is if you look at the Untimely Meditations with Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly his essay on the uses and abuses of history. And in that document, he highlights that there are three ways in which we can relate or in particular use history. So we can utilize history to our ends, but we can also abuse history. So he gives us three figures or three themes. The first is monumental history. So monumental history treats historical events and figures as the peaks of mountains. And each monument, each statue is a connecting point in human history of human greatness. And this is very similar to Hannah Arendt's position on Herodotus. In impartially showing the greatness of the Persians and the Greeks, it allowed us to, again, show a greater humanity. And so monumental history looks towards the past and says, what can we be reminded of? We can be reminded of our greatness, and we can then equally take part. So that statue of George Washington as a heroic figure that Kirk mentioned, we can also have other historical figures follow through. And we're all part of that great mountain range. The second type of history is antiquarian history. And this history is really concerned with reverence. What figures can we look towards our past and say that they deserve to remain unchanged because they teach us lessons? They can be ethical, moral, political, cultural. They teach us lessons that we should keep preserved for all time. So this is a history that looks backwards to take what should be unchanged from it. And last but not least, it's critical history. And for this, Nietzsche is really straight to the point where he says all past deserve condemnation. It's not European, it's not just African, it's not colonial, it's not Confederate. All past are worthy of condemnation. And he really states this because he says, as living subjects, we're using history not simply for historical ends. We're not just trying to find out historical facts or the truth of the past. We're using history actively as agents. And so if there are figures in the past or events or structures that are historicized, that are monumentalized, well, one thing we can always do is say, well, do we create a monument to criticize something we want to condemn? Or in vandalism, or what I call monumental defacement, do we also criticize? Do we also tear down? Do we also give a new narrative? And for me, the critical history, this is the history that is usually missing from debates or missing from positions, because the idea is, again, if controversy must be avoided at all costs, can we not find some middle ground? Can we not neutralize the issue by being ourselves neutral? Claiming that history can be representative while also not being endorsing. Whereas critical history says, no, sometimes we have to utilize history, utilize whatever is at hand in order to condemn certain practices. So much like the Christopher Columbus statue in the North End, that decapitation was using history critically. It was saying that there is something in Columbus's past, so as an actual historical figure that he did that was worthy of decapitation, or as an ideal, Christopher Columbus, the discoverer of America, that was criticizing settler colonialism. That saying is not something right about our current political arrangements, and that through this one figure, through this one act of decapitation or vandalism or iconoclasm, this will bring a critical engagement with history. And many people in Boston, or I don't know how nationally or internationally the news traveled, unfortunately, but I know many people in Boston were again asking, well, why was Columbus decapitated? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. They only know that childhood song. Or, well, Columbus was a discovered America. Isn't that a good thing? Didn't it help lead to the United States, of which we are a part of? So again, that is one way or one mode of engaging. But if we can look at all three forms, what I at least tend towards, and maybe this is the more activist streak of me, is that if we can use history in this multitude of ways, what we're being called on when we see controversial monuments or protests, vandalism, is for more direct engagement, more direct questioning, more direct ways of seeing these multiple positions and saying, what are we called to do with our history? And I think one of the best representations of like this critical history, and I'll rather go quickly because I wanted to give a good sample. So we have the National Monument Towards Lynching, which is part of the EPA project in Alabama that again deals with lynching. The United States has never created, and by created I mean the government, has never created a monument towards lynching, to enslavement, to settler colonialism. We can the Chinese Exclusion Act. We can go on and on if we're talking about crimes. So this organization created a monument to lynching, and that's a critical construction, a critical engagement with something that has been, if not erased, at least not as well studied. Or if we're moving away from the United States, if we're moving a little bit south in Mexico City, there's a great monument called the ABC statue. And as noted, it's a colorful statue, almost as if you were in a children's room. So you have the ABC, and right on top of it, you have the numbers 49. And so activists put this statue down right in front of the Mexican Social Security office because a daycare facility called ABC in northern Mexico had a fire and 49 children died. And so that monument was put in place to have a critical engagement with the actual political structure of the country, to say that this was a failure, not only of an institution, but of a government, and it still hasn't been rectified. So there are ways in which we can build new monuments and they satisfy that critical engagement. But because again, we're dealing with controversy and protests, we don't only build new monuments to criticize. And I think Chong-Ming was pointing that out, that sometimes we also tackle or dismantle, destructure, or destroy existing monuments we find controversial. And by we, I mean activists, people that have a position in that state. And I think one of the most globally significant, we'll say, acts of fallism or acts of vandalism is Roads Must Fall. So both in South Africa And in the UK, we have the figure of Cecil Rhodes, who famously stated that if I could, I would colonize the stars. And so this was an advocate of not only colonialism in Africa, but we still have the issue of the De Beers Diamond Company and exploitation that is still ongoing. So this figure who, if you're taking monumental history, according to Nietzsche, did monumental things. Monumental, according to Nietzsche, can be good or bad. According to Hannah Arendt, could be good or bad. Does Cecil Rhodes still figure in South African history? Yes, he's a very important figure. If you're using monumental history and only monumental history, some people are using antiquarian history and saying Cecil Rhodes not only wanted to colonize, again, after his heart attack or the story about his heart attack, he also was showed a lot of anti-Black racism. So some people revere Cecil Rhodes for that racism, for that colonialism, and saying we should keep that going. But critical history asks us to step in and saying, if our government is not acting quick enough, we can tear down this statue ourselves. We can say that this doesn't belong to our community. Now, the issue, of course, is how are activists allowed to speak for entire communities? So I do think that is an issue a lot of people find controversial. But I also think with monuments are on the whole never democratically elected, never democratically founded. They're usually donations from people with wealth and money. So on that end, I wash my hands of it. I'm saying if it wasn't democratically placed, do what you find well and good. But philosophically, it is an issue when it comes to an activist position or for fallism or vandalism. Again, how do we, even if we find something controversial, when can we, as the people, enact changes or engage with history? I think with Nietzsche, at least, this critical engagement of history is not circumscribed by democracy or democratic considerations. But for those who do like democracy, I do think it is a worry and a concern that frequently comes up. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But one thing I wanted to return to is that if we compare this mode of critical history with historical neutrality, one thing I really want to point out, and this is two positions, is that with historical neutrality, even though I think it's a moderate position, again, Nietzsche points out that history can be used and abused. So even moderate positions can be abused in certain ways. And I feel at times, or I would rather claim at times, that historical neutrality frequently follows the monumental history position or the antiquarian position. It wants to say that maybe it's multiplying who's considered or whose histories are considered, but it still says this was a monumental deed. And so whether it's good or bad, we're going to have both positions, but we're going to maintain it. Or when it comes to reverence, okay, we're not revering one side of Columbus's story. We're also in this one statue revering the indigenous stories. And this could be whether through constructing a new monument to indigeneity, doing a plaque, amending the texture, the text of the actual monument. But I find what both historical neutrality and these two positions do is they lose out on the criticality, the call for judgment, the call for action and engagement. That sometimes when we're engaging with history, we're not calling for equal reverence. And by we, I should substitute this with activists. Some activists aren't calling for equal reverence of both stories. Some activists are equally saying that the bad doesn't have a place in our story. And so because this is a critical position, we also have to engage with that counter position, that this might be moderate and more accepting of more stories, but if you're actively being called to judge, actively being called to condemn, you're equally being called to answer these arguments. Not to say that these arguments can't be answered, but I frequently find those arguments being shut off because the fear of controversy, the fear of protest, the fear of any type of political disagreement is so apropos. or so, not apropos, so I think people fear political disagreement at this point in time and would rather cut off that disagreement or the reasons for it rather than engage in healthy politics. The second point that I'd like to make is that although I was, at least in this talk, really utilizing Nietzsche and his theory of history, I'd also say that monuments aren't only history. And Chong-Ming alluded to this when he talked about the aesthetic dimensions. In my four-dimensional model, I say that history or monuments frequently deal with both history, politics, ethics, and aesthetics. They're combinations of these four dominant modes, so neither of these categories take priority. And with an asterisk, there are some activist positions where I think they say the politics of it do outweigh those other considerations, but on the whole, if we're looking at the Monument of Discovery in Lisboa, in Portugal, again, one of my favorite monuments. It's right on the Tagus River, my favorite river in the world. Yes, it's my favorite river in the world, but it's also a monument of discovery in the sense of exploration and colonization. And as someone who's Cabo Verdean, what does it mean that I think a monument that helped colonize my country and people is beautiful? I think on that end, that's when you actually get political conversation. That's when you get ethical concerns that might outweigh history and aesthetics. And I think you see that if we move again to Belgium, where a lot of people are now dealing with the history of King Leopold II, who in colonizing the Congo Free State, led to millions of death and brutalization. So I think that country is now, again, debating their own internal history. So I think Portugal might come to a place where they look at the monument discovery and say, does that have a place in our public? But again, I am not Portuguese, so I might have my own position, but I think the Portuguese people or the people of Lisboa also have to come to their own decisions because it's dealing with their locality. So with that being said, the last thing I'll say is, and this might be the more activist position in me, the person who really likes Nietzsche's understanding of history, is that I do believe history belongs to the living. And again, it requires engagement. So I really think all the talks or the talk by Kirk and Chong-Ming really brought that out. And I really want to highlight, like, that's, if anything from my talk, that is my takeaway. So again, thank you everyone. And I'll turn it over to Nur.
Thank you, Dana. That was really great. So we're a little over the time, but that's okay. We can stay a few minutes after. Those of you who can stay. Why don't you raise your hands if you have a question, not your real hand, but your hand in Zoom. There's a more button on the bottom right of your screen there, which you can use to raise your hand, and we will scroll through the participant list and call on you. Try to keep the questions succinct so we can get as many as we can in. And I am turning it over to our listeners. Let's see. Any questions? So maybe I'll take the moderator's prerogative and begin with a question that Dana suggested, or a topic that Dana suggested at the very end of his comments, but in different ways came up in all of the presentations. To what extent are monuments history? And we also see this in sort of one of the arguments against removal as the argument against removing our history. And to what extent are they the opposite of history, in the sense that history is complicated, multi-layered, ambivalent, and monuments in some sense are the opposite of that. So Churchill, for example, on many views would deserve a monument for his conduct or for much of his conduct during World War II. but would deserve the opposite of a monument for much of his life prior to that. So a Churchill monument is a freezing of one part of his legacy, right? Um, I guess my question is, aren't monuments actually anti-historical? That can go to any of our speakers.
I'm happy to jump in. So I would say, you know, I'm asked this question a lot,
Yeah.
and I usually point out that I feel that monuments do as much to erase history as they do to establish it. And so, you know, they are, as Dana pointed out, they are erected by particular people with their own agendas. They're not erected by some kind of democratic or consensual process. They're erected by small groups of people with agendas, and they end up, because of those particularized agendas, they end up erasing large swaths of history. So we can see that with, I mean, Columbus erases indigenous history, right? So by the Confederate monuments erase the history of slavery, they erase unionism, they erase all kinds of things. So, and they're very powerful in doing that. So it's not just looking at them as objects, but it's looking at their effects in society, because they are honorific objects that have been allowed to speak, you know, for history in place of history, you know, other kinds of forms of history making. So, you know, I feel like they have enormous power in erasing other historical stories, and in ways that maybe textbooks and other forms of history don't actually have as much power.
That's very helpful. I'm seeing that some people aren't finding the hand, so you can also just message us. Lauren McGillicuddy, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm thinking about statues in Boston, and particularly the Emancipation statue. And I'm also thinking about some of the newer statues. For instance, we have a statue in Boston that memorializes the victims of the Irish famine. Now, no one in Boston was afflicted by the Irish famine, but many Irish people living in Boston feel very strongly about the Irish famine. And the monument is in a way of oddly glamorizing the famine, and America is a place where you came to escape from it. The money to build that statue was given not by wealthy people mostly, nor was the statue, the Emancipation statue that had the dreadful Emancipation statue that has a figure of an African man kneeling in chains, kneeling in front of Lincoln. And I remember thinking even as a child how horrible that thing was. But the statue is, I'm sorry about the phone. The statue was paid for by freed slaves. How does the fact that it's a terrible statue paid for by freed slaves, or that this statue of the famine in Ireland memorializes something that didn't happen here, but it was paid for by Irish people here? How do you deal with these statues? Are of their moment, and yet we still always have to live with them. How do you deal with honoring the intent of the people who made the statue when their intent is honorable? I'm not saying that, for instance, Confederates, the statues that were erected to glorify the Confederacy had an honorable purpose. They did not. But how do you honor the good intentions of people who erect problematic monuments?
So I can answer. That's okay. I think you're touching upon a very important subject, and I think it really depends on how you think people should relate to monuments. So for many people, and I'm not saying this is your argument, I'll relate it back, that what takes the primary consideration is what the people at the time of construction actually meant with the monument. So not using hindsight, not really theorizing from our contemporary mindset. So this is in reference to the Emancipation Monument that again paid for by freed slaves. So should we not look at that intent and really use that as our primary consideration? I think many people have that position, but I also think if we're referring back to critical history, if history is always being used for the living, what the living find useful today might be very different than what those freed slaves were considering at their time. So for me, I think having these type of conversations and really engaging with people makes it more complicated and makes us more wary of just tearing down things that we find aesthetically displeasing or uncomfortable today. Because I think, again, history is important in these considerations.
Excellent. Chong-Ming, did you want to chime in too?
Yeah, I just want to echo Dana's view that we shouldn't take. I think of course we want to think that the intentions of the people who brought about or had some say in the process of erecting the statue should play, I think, a role in how we evaluate those statues, but we cannot, I think, take them to be the sole determinant. So as Dana has mentioned, we need to think about all the other ways in which we're called upon by these monuments to respond to our own history, including, I think, and especially the broader context in which these purportedly good intentions occurred. So yeah.
Other questions from our listeners? You can just jump in and ask if you want, or type them in the comments while you think of. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Nino, did you have a question?
Yes, I have. Yes, thank you so much for this discussion. I'm really loving it. I'm joining in from Canada, where I work and teach here, but I'm originally from Georgia, which used to be a Soviet country. So, I mean, in both countries, I feel there is such a need for this critical engagement, what Dana was talking about, and Kirk also talks about this in-depth understanding of not just monuments, but where they come from. And it's not always there. And it seems to me that this critical engagement requires readiness and even courage. So how we create that, that courage and that readiness on political level, but also on societal level, to create this opening for that kind of engagement.
Any one of our panelists who wants to take that?
I wanted to point out an example of what I think is a really successful example of engagement and critical engagement, as well as dialogue between groups that were seemingly opposed. And this again is from about a Columbus statue, but it's in Los Angeles. And that monument was ultimately taken down in 2018, but not before. It was only as a result of a series of conversations that Indigenous activists had with Italian American, people from Italian American organizations, in which they really talked about the harms that Columbus had done to their communities and particularly to their youth. And they were particularly, I think what was particularly effective was in talking about their youth and the disproportionately high rates of suicide that afflict native tribal communities in this country, low levels of self-esteem and drug use and so on, all disproportionately affecting native youth versus, mainstream white youth. And so they were really able to have an engaged conversation about the harms of the monuments. This was not a neutral academic kind of debate at all. This was about, the monument as a kind of living thing that continues to harm their communities. And eventually they agreed. The Italian American representatives agreed through a series of conversations. They agreed to its removal, and it was done, by the city with a ceremony actually that took place at the removal. So that doesn't happen very often, right? That kind of engagement is rare, but I would say that if we could figure out ways to encourage that kind of engagement and create structures for that kind of engagement in which people actually engage in that kind of dialogue, we would probably advance a long way in our both our understanding of these monuments and also in ameliorating the harms that they do.
So, Nara, can I jump in quickly?
Please.
I just want to say that I don't know, unfortunately, of any Canadian organizations, but I know the work the Applied Ethics Center did in actually going to high schools and teaching a course and having students go into the city of Boston and look up controversial monuments is an active way for young adults to engage in these conversations. So when they become adult, they have the knowledge and the wherewithal. But if you're also interested, the organization Monument Lab in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, does a lot of creative work with communities and monuments. And the Paper Monument in New Orleans, Louisiana, is also doing the same thing. So I'm sorry, I just don't know of any Canadian ones.
I want to, oh, sorry.
Sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I just to quickly add on, I think one important thing we can try to do is also to try to disabuse ourselves from the idea that just because something is part of our history or heritage, it has to be good and we have to endorse it. So, I think public education can go a long way in trying to get people to think more clearly about the fact that something can be part of our history, but it can be bad and we can reject it. Just in the same way that someone can be a close family member, but we absolutely hate what they say. But it doesn't kind of remove the fact that they're still our family members. So I think public education can go quite some way on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one more technical point. There are some resources, specifically, for example, the high school syllabus that we developed is on the website of the Applied Ethics Center. I'll put the link in the comments, as well as some recordings of events that the students took part in, which may be of interest to people. Other questions? Feel free to just jump in if you have other questions. So I was going to ask our panelists earlier. I've been reading of some monuments that are designed in time to sink into the ground. And I've been thinking about that as a paradigm for future monument design. There's something attractive about that in the sense of the modesty that we have about what we honor now being honored in the indeterminate future, in perhaps sort of providing a sense of urgency for engaging with the monument if your sense of its permanence is questioned. What do you think about that as a design paradigm?
I'm all for creative ways of engaging in monuments, and it reminds me of my high school that because they misplaned it, it's sinking into the ground. So for various reasons, I love the idea.
That's great.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely great as well. Though one important thing that strikes me is, in the design process, we should also think about how long the people who erect the monuments think it will take for the monument to sink entirely to the ground. Have they planned it for 10 years? Have they planned it for 20 years? Have they planned, for the statue to kind of completely sink to the ground in like a year or two? I think that makes an important, difference to how we and the people who kind of relate to the monument understand what is trying to be, what's being conveyed here. Yeah.
Well, that's a great point. That's a great point. Kirk, have you had any experience?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, no, I'm a big believer in the idea that monuments should be on different kinds of time scales, because they really aren't permanent. It really is a fiction. And in order to maintain the fiction of permanence, a huge amount of work has to be done to maintain monuments, to keep them looking like they were originally. But and I'm very interested in the issue of obsolescence, because eventually all monuments become obsolete. I mean, their meanings are changing constantly over time. Their settings are changing, but eventually they will become obsolete. And we see this especially in war memorials, where typically when the community of veterans and their families are dead, by the time that generation and a couple of generations dies off, the memorials become, for all intents and purposes, obsolete. And Philip Kennicott, who's a writer for the Washington Post, once proposed the idea of deaccessioning war memorials, which I think is an absolutely wonderful idea, like taking the Vietnam Veterans Memorial or the Korean War Veterans Memorial off the mall when everyone has died, is associated with the Vietnam War, and moving the monument to Arlington Cemetery so that we could build something new on the mall. And I think the more we can think about monuments in that way, as having a certain lifespan, which can then actually end. I mean, I think that's very liberating, and it allows us to renew the landscape and renew ourselves as communities.
Yeah. A friend reminded me the other day about this wonderful poem by Shelley about Ozymandias and the person walking through the desert and seeing the sort of broken off and mostly sunk base of a statue of a king, and it says something like, "I'm Ozymandias, king of kings. Look at my works and weep, you mortals." And it's mostly gone. And I thought that captured the rationale of some of what maybe the sinking monument idea as well. Any last questions or comments from our listeners before we're done for this evening?
I'd like to chime in if that's okay. I've been trying to come up with just one question to ask, but I feel like we've touched upon so many different things, and I'm tuning in from The Hague right now, so pardon me if I'm not totally clear. It is 1 a.m. So I work at the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation. It's a body or a research center that works within Euroclio, and we try to teach history in a multi-perspective and pluralistic way by developing curricula. And this is an EU-funded project, so it's all about finding commonality in difference. But my background is Ukrainian, and the point you made, Lauren, about diaspora monuments to me was very interesting, coupled with this idea of removing a monument after a certain time period has passed. I was socialized in a very traumatized diaspora, World War II diaspora that clings to a narrative of martyrdom, kind of singular narrative of Western Ukrainian martyrdom. And I've also studied other traumatized diasporas, whether they're Sikh diasporas in Canada or other, for example, post-Soviet diasporas. And it doesn't seem like that trauma dies or that event dies even after everyone who lived through it passes. And I'm constantly baffled by my own community and don't really know how to address these complex events. For example, the Ukrainian insurgent army. There are monuments to the Ukrainian insurgent army all over Canada as well as in the US. And yes, that is one dimension of World War II for the Ukrainian public, but it doesn't capture the darker legacies of Ukrainian independence movements during World War II. And my question, I'm trying to get to a question, but is more that how do we try to, because I know this neutrality issue is problematic and you do want to address certain things, but it's trauma for many groups involved. How do we respect while still kind of pushing for a historical reckoning? Or maybe asked differently, are we looking for historical reckoning, or are we trying to maintain physical peace? And I think this is something my organization right now is trying to figure out. Are we trying to ask people to, have a critical understanding of history? Do we decapitate Empress Josephine? Is that enough? Will they take her down entirely? They did end up tearing her down, I believe, Martinique this summer after being vandalized. Or are we just trying to make sure there isn't more violence over, our understanding of monuments? So whether it's like a literal physical piece or a historical reckoning that we're searching for here, and what should take the priority?
Thank you. Panelists.
So I would just say I think it depends on your political position. For instance, in a different context in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with the monuments that took place, with the narratives, a lot of, I'd say, some leftist or radical leanings have argued that the TRC was a failure in certain ways in prioritizing reconciliation without addressing harms. And so you had in that same narrative of like South Africa having more wealth discrepancy after apartheid ended than before, feeds into that narrative of the rainbow children. They might have gained some measure of freedom, but they didn't get rid of the issue of colonialism or the issue of racism in South African society. And so I think in areas or countries or nation where there's differences between groups or political conflict, I think you're always going to be balanced between reconciliation and reckoning. Sometimes people use revolution, retribution. That's always the debate that's going on, and that's actually why I became interested in monuments. I saw that in monuments towards reconciliation, such as the Verdun monument between France and Germany, two nations were able to reconcile and use that monument as a point after the war where they can say we can now enter into friendly relations. But I also know that France never had a reconciliation monument with Haiti, with all these other colonized countries. So I'm saying, so for me, it's a question of, I think, is reconciliation possible for only certain groups of people, or only at certain times? And so for me, I don't think like I can answer quickly because there's so many different groups, so many different people, but I definitely understand the focus. And I think a lot of people are focused on that question.
Kirk, did you, I saw you added a comment on intergenerational trauma. Did you want to add?
Yeah, well, so I mean, this is also true of, the Columbus Monument, and part of what the indigenous activists there talked about was intergenerational trauma. Going back many, many generations. I mean, talking about, the trauma of removal and displacement in the early to mid 19th century, and the way that those wounds, historical wounds, actually sort of continue to physically harm, indigenous populations. And I just think the question you raised is so interesting and so fascinating, when trauma becomes intergenerational and when it doesn't. I think it's increasingly become intergenerational in our lifetime because trauma has become a source of identity. And so it's held on to, I think, and if there's any conflict. But the question that you pose is one that I really want to think more about, because I don't have the answer to. It's when does the monumental controversy actually add fuel to the fire, right? Like, I think that's what I took from your question, that by focusing on, maybe even by trying to build a monument, you might even increasingly stoke even more tension and conflict rather than reconciliation. and how we just structure processes that might work towards reconciliation rather than, polarization, which is what often happens with monuments, right? They often stoke polarization.
And just on that specific point that Kirk just made, there's actually two arguments that often actually come from the liberal left. Again, one of them is the sort of view that sees monuments as red herrings, as saying, this is polarizing and makes it more difficult to reach islands of agreement where we can reach them, right? And so let's not focus on the legacy of monuments is an argument that you quite often hear. The other one is a fascinating argument that's adapted and goes directly to your point, Kirk, adapted from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And the point there is that in order to attach yourself to your decent views, you have to have some kind of consistently offending reminder, as it were, in public space, so that the argument against having offensive or problematic monuments is that in some way they fight complacency. Now, Mill, of course, in the 19th century wasn't really thinking about re-traumatizing, but there's the sort of classical liberal argument floating around in that context. CM, did you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, I had actually very coincidentally wanted to say something about the idea that monuments are red herrings. And so I think I take it that, we don't want to fixate on the monuments themselves, but we want also to look at what else is being said to address the lingering effects of trauma and oppression, especially when it becomes intergenerational. So and the leftist argument, as it were, is to say that what we can do what we like to these monuments, but if we do nothing about these lingering effects, little would have been achieved. But I think this is exactly what activists are also saying, and I think especially for activists who try to raise these issues about addressing trauma and addressing oppression through dealing with tainted monuments in certain ways. I take it that it is a kind of calculated gamble on the part, right? So you can begin in abstract, about these lingering effects and of trauma and oppression, but what's the quickest and fastest way to get people's attention? You smash some shit up, and people pay attention, and then we can begin a conversation about what we ought to do about these lingering effects, and then we can have a conversation about how historical injustice has affected and is still affecting people who are still living. So I think we shouldn't fixate too much on monuments, but we shouldn't downplay, I think, activists' intention or aims of trying to get people to think about the monuments.
Absolutely. So I think we're running out of time, or more precisely, running over time. I want to thank all three of you, Kirk, Chong-Ming, and Dana, for fascinating presentations, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and giving us the time. Really enjoyed it a lot. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And there's even a clapping button, so the wonders of Zoom. And thank you for everybody who's joined us from different time zones. That's very moving indeed. Go to sleep. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you again.